Isabella knew she couldn't keep it a secret for much longer. She had to tell someone who could help them. But who? Michael was just as lost as she was, and neither of them trusted anyone enough to share their burden. They began talking in hushed tones about what they should do. "Maybe we can just hide it," Michael suggested, his voice full of uncertainty. "Maybe no one will notice." But deep down, they both knew that wasn't possible. The truth would come out eventually. But how would they explain it? How could they tell their parents what had happened when they weren't there? The days turned into weeks, and still the pull of what they had discovered on the phone was too strong for Michael and Isabella to resist. The two friends continued meeting secretly, sneaking around their homes to find moments when their parents were distracted. Each time they delved deeper into the forbidden world they had unlocked, their curiosity growing with each encounter. It was no longer just about watching. It was about feeling, experiencing, and trying to understand what they didn't fully comprehend. One evening after dinner, Isabella came to Michael's house. She looked nervous, but the glint of excitement in her eyes was hard to ignore. "Michael," she whispered, "I think we should try it again. I can't stop thinking about it. We should know more about what we saw." Michael hesitated, but the temptation was too great. "You're right. We need to understand it." "Just one more time," he said, though his heart raced as he spoke. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with anticipation. They sat on Michael's bed, the phone between them. As they opened the app again, it felt like they were crossing a line they couldn't return from. The content seemed darker now, more intense, but they couldn't look away. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a need, an addiction. They tried to replicate the actions they saw, not really understanding what they were doing, but simply drawn to the idea that it would give them answers. After that night, things started to change. The initial feelings of guilt began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of familiarity. Michael and Isabella began to feel like this was just a part of their lives. They saw each other more often, meeting in secluded places, parks, empty classrooms, or behind the old library. Each time they returned to the phone, to the videos, to the actions they saw. "You don't think it's wrong anymore, do you?" Isabella asked one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael, still unsure, shook his head. It's not like we're hurting anyone. We're just curious. It's just between us." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. They were crossing a line. They both were, and they knew it. Isabella was the first to suggest it. "What if we just try what they did? We don't have to tell anyone, just us. We can stop whenever we want." Michael was silent for a moment, his heart pounding, but the pull, the unspoken desire, was too strong. "Okay, just once," he whispered, and so they did. What began as innocent exploration quickly spiraled into a dangerous game. They didn't fully understand what they were doing, but the more they tried to mimic what they saw on the phone, the harder it became to stop. The more they met, the more their lives seemed to drift from the ones they had known. Isabella became quieter at home, retreating into herself. Michael started staying late after school, avoiding his parents' gaze whenever they asked where he had been. The weight of what they were doing was pressing down on them, but neither knew how to stop. One evening, as they sat together in Michael's room, Isabella looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Michael, do you think this is wrong?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "What we're doing, it doesn't feel right, but I can't stop." Michael looked at her, his own guilt eating him up inside. "I don't know anymore, Isabella, but I can't stop either." They both knew they were in too deep. The phone had given them something they couldn't undo, something they couldn't unsee, but they couldn't stop, not when the desire to try again burned so deeply. Their encounters grew more frequent, and with each one, the lines between them blurred. What had once been an innocent friendship was now tainted by something darker, something they couldn't fully understand, but couldn't escape. They tried to go back to their normal lives, but the weight of their secret pulled them back together, every time. One afternoon, after a particularly long session on the phone, Isabella approached Michael with a new suggestion. Maybe we should try it more," she said. "We're not learning anything just by watching. We need to understand it, to feel it, so we know what it's about." Michael hesitated, his heart racing at the thought. Isabella, we can't keep doing this. What if someone finds out? But Isabella wasn't listening. What if no one does? We're just curious. It's just us, Michael. No one else has to know. And so they met more frequently, continuing to push the boundaries of what they'd learned from the phone. The more they did, the harder it became to control their actions. They were no longer just playing a game. They were seeking answers, seeking experiences that their young minds couldn't fully comprehend. Days later, Isabella missed school. Michael was concerned, but when he visited her house, she looked pale and distant. "I don't feel well, Michael," she whispered when he knocked on her door. At first, he thought it was just a flu or maybe something else minor, but as she avoided his gaze, his worry deepened. "Isabella, are you okay?" he asked. She hesitated before finally speaking. "Michael, I think I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. He couldn't speak at first, his mind racing. He hadn't even thought about the consequences. They hadn't used protection. They hadn't even understood what they were doing. It had all been a mistake that had led them to this point. I don't know what to do, Michael," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "I never thought it would happen. We weren't careful. We were just playing." Michael's world shattered in that moment. The consequences of their actions were no longer something they could hide from. "We can't tell anyone," he said, his voice low. "We can't tell our parents. They'll never understand." But even as he said it, he knew they couldn't keep the secret forever. It was too big to ignore. But what could they do now? They were trapped by their own choices. The two friends spent the next few weeks trying to hide the truth from their parents. They tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the tension between them was palpable. Michael found himself constantly on edge, wondering if anyone would notice the shift in their behavior. Isabella became more withdrawn, her once bright eyes now shadowed by the fear of what was to come. They tried to figure out a plan, a way to deal with the situation without anyone finding out. "Maybe we can just pretend it never happened," Michael suggested one evening. "Maybe no one will ever know." But deep down, both of them knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. They were running out of time, and soon the consequences of their actions would become undeniable. As the days wore on, Isabella's condition became more apparent. She was tired all the time, and she couldn't hide her growing fear anymore. "What are we going to do, Michael?" she asked one evening, her voice trembling. "What if we get caught? What if someone finds out?" Michael didn't know what to say. The fear in Isabella's eyes mirrored his own. The thought of their parents finding out, of facing the consequences of their actions, was terrifying. But even more terrifying was the fact that they had no idea what to do next. They were trapped in a web of their own making, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find a way out. Isabella couldn't hide her fear anymore. Her condition was becoming more obvious, and each day that passed felt like a countdown. The secret they had been carrying was growing too heavy to bear. One evening, as she sat in her room, staring at the wall, she realized that she couldn't face it alone anymore. She needed to tell someone who could help them. "Michael," she said when they met at their usual spot behind the library, "I can't do this anymore. I don't know what to do. What if my parents find out?" Michael looked at her, his face pale. He had been avoiding the subject, too afraid to confront it. But now, seeing Isabella so broken, he knew they couldn't keep running from the truth. "We can't tell them yet, Isabella. They won't understand. They'll never forgive us." "But what if it gets worse?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I can't hide it anymore? What if someone sees?" The fear in her eyes was raw, and Michael could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. For the first time, Michael realized they were no longer just trying to hide a mistake. They were living a lie that was growing with every passing day. He felt trapped, unable to make a choice that wouldn't change everything. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, his voice filled with panic. "But we need to figure this out before it's too late." A week later, things began to unravel. Isabella couldn't hide the truth any longer. She had missed her period, and the sickness she felt every morning was becoming impossible to ignore. Her once glowing face had turned pale. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. Every time she looked at Michael, she saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. but neither of them could find the words to make it better. One afternoon, Isabella's mother came into her room while she was lying on her bed, her hand over her stomach. "Isabella," her mother said softly, "you don't look well. Are you feeling all right?" Isabella stiffened. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't lie anymore. The weight of the truth pressed against her ribs. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. I think I need to tell you something," Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper. I think I might be pregnant." Her mother froze, her expression unreadable. "Pregnant? What do you mean? You're just a child, Isabella. How could this happen?" Isabella felt the tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. "I don't know, Mom. I don't know how it happened. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen." Her mother's face softened, but there was still shock in her eyes. "You're not a child anymore, Isabella, but we'll figure this out. You don't have to go through this alone." The relief Isabella felt was fleeting. She had confessed, but she couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. She had betrayed her parents' trust, and now she had to face the consequences.